we're still expecting organic waste to increase 70% by 2050. So it's really forcing us as a society to reconcile what are we doing with the waste we produce? And that's where our industry steps in as a ready solution to help improve current waste management practices.
We just got done going through a period of extreme inflation when it comes to food costs. A big component of that is energy. Production, transportation. A large component of that escalation is energy.
The oil industry is still subsidized by the federal government. And so all we're looking for is a level playing field where we can take a common sense approach and just capture the inevitable environmental impact of greenhouse gas emissions like methane and CO2 from our growing waste streams.
Welcome to the Tyler Dickerhoof podcast with me, your host, Tyler Dickerhoof. On today's episode, I'm joined by Johannes Escudero. Johannes is a founder and chief executive of the Coalition for Renewable Natural Gas. The RNG Coalition represents and provides public policy advocacy and education for the renewable gas industry in North America. That's what he does, kind of his professional life. He also is a person that I've gotten to know through different leadership circles, through the John Maxwell, the high capacity leaders as well. Johannes, we have a mutual friend. His name is George Marashi. How do you know George?
I don't know that I know George, to be honest,
okay.
Tyler. So
well, I know that you guys interact. Well, that was an absolute bomb, but we'll get back to that. So we were talking about earlier.
No, clearly.
No, I mean, you guys have interacted on Instagram, so I figured you know, but maybe you don't. We'll talk about that later. So I used to live in California. I lived in Bakersfield for 8 years. You live in California. You spent a bit of time in Sacramento, right? You worked in Sacramento. Thank you for that service. But when I first moved to California, I lived in Tracy, and then I lived in Modesto, and then found my way to Bakersfield. So you lamented my existence in Bakersfield, and I just moved progressively south.
Only because you had to live there at some point. I've got great friends in Bakersfield to this day. But look, you'd probably, Tyler, be hard-pressed to invite anyone else on your show that would be able to identify with Bakersfield, Modesto. Did you say Tracy?
Oh, yeah. Spent a hot minute in Tracy.
I know exactly where I've been.
Yeah.
I've spent more time in each of those towns than I care to admit. Maybe that explains the cow behind you. I'd love to hear more about the beautiful bovine you got there.
Part of living in California is I was a nutritionist for dairy cows. So I worked with dairies, and I had clients from really Modesto through Escondido when I worked there, and it was primarily in the Central Valley. And so that's what I did. And so what's really interesting is I saw this newswire that just showed up yesterday, quite honestly. And I'd love for you to weigh in your perspective. Obviously, you're involved in the energy sphere. We're in this massive evolving economy of energy. And I say economy because it is economy. And one of the things that we're talking about is how big oil is now starting to say, oh, how can we get our claws into this biogas methane that is produced on dairies? So I'd love for you to just elaborate a little bit more from your perspective, what you know. We can talk a little bit about that, but then we'll get into this kind of whole energy sphere, and then we'll get into all the other leadership stuff.
Love that. No, okay. Well, I mean, I think in doing some of my own, background research, identifying some of your experience growing up in an agricultural environment, I was curious if some of the conversation would go there, and I love that. Love that. So for those in your audience who may not be familiar with what biogas is, essentially what we're talking about is anytime you have organic material that will decompose naturally, and as it does so, it emits a natural cocktail of gases, at least 17 different gas constituents, primarily methane and CO2. And so that methane CO2 can be sequestered. It can be converted into various forms of renewable energy like fuel, heat, power, and other secondary products like soil amendments and fertilizers. So we're literally taking the otherwise inevitable harmful environmental impacts from society's growing waste streams and redeeming it and converting it from a liability into an energy asset. So that's in short what our industry does. And that's what biogas is. It's that raw gas cocktail. Our industry takes it a step further. We capture that biogas stream and we condition it to a near pure methane content so that you can literally use it as a drop-in replacement fuel in vehicles and homes and businesses to replace conventional natural gas. So stovetops, boiler tips, right? Medium and heavy duty vehicles, residential, commercial buildings, facilities, etc. So yeah, that's biogas. When we first started as an organization, kind of like Chick-fil-A, right? Chick-fil-A doesn't take any credit for inventing the chicken. They just are kind of perfecting the fried chicken sandwich in some circles. Biogas predated our organization's founding. It's as old as human waste, right?
Yeah.
But what we did is we coalesced the industry that existed, that was on our radar 13 and a half years ago. And then we coined the phrase renewable natural gas for the upgraded product or the commodity that you can upgrade raw biogas into. And through effective leadership, education, advocacy, we've been able to create market demand for these commodities. And in the course of doing that, Tyler, to your original question, the oil refiners and companies like Shell, Chevron, BP, Marathon, to soar others, really viewed renewable energy, I think, through a certain lens and with respect to biogas or RNG as we were evolving 13 and a half years ago, as a little bit of an affront to traditional energy sources. And
you're taking my spot at the table, right?
Yeah, well, I don't even think it was that, because we were such a literally drop in the bucket and still are in many respects. But I think any encroachment on margin, profit or otherwise, is encroachment nonetheless, right? And what we're really proud of is, again, through effective leadership, education, and advocacy, have helped to win the argument and bridge the education gap that existed. That look, this is a unique lens that I make sure our team is constantly looking through with all of our efforts to reduce, reuse, recycle, and improve and increase energy efficiency and reduce our demand on foreign imports and increase our production of renewable energy sources. There's a huge geopolitical consideration that we can't ignore, right? Like, and I love to look in this. I'm bipartisan. If you drill down, you're going to probably find I'm a libertarian at heart. As a man of faith, it's like don't paint me into any party corner. I like this about them. I love that about us. Wish this was different. Really, 350 million people in America, and in the last 25 years, we've had 3 families running for president. I mean, we can go any way you want. But I think when you step back, you look at the Biden-Harris administration and all the promises, the bravado in that first State of the Union that our president offered, including commitments and statements like 100% electrification of vehicles by 2030, or I think is the date he threw out initially.
Yeah.
Divestiture from fossil fuels. And what's the reality, though? Our consumption of natural gas has increased every single year under the administration. So, and again, I think it all points back to, like, politically, it makes sense to posture or position ourselves this way to align with these, interests here. But the reality is, if we stop buying oil, what are we doing, right?
Have you watched the show The Landman?
Oh, that's my favorite show. That's my favorite show. I agree.
And what I
appreciate about what Landman was, Tyler. Landman was, for guys like you and me who are probably lamenting the end of Yellowstone.
Oh yeah, very much.
Gave us something to fill that void with. Yeah, right? Yeah. Love Landman.
I love how Taylor Sheridan, he's done this in Yellowstone, he's done this with his other shows, really, goes back to the blue collar, the calloused hands, this is really what America lives and breathes by, not what's produced in this soundstage in, wherever. And it's like, no, these are really the industries that make everything go around. So whatever image you have, one, it's probably not as glamorous. 1, 2, it's also that meaningful. And I remember there was a clip and the character Tommy, Billy Bob
Billy
Thornton.
Bob Thornton.
And he's talking about windmills, and he's like, the life
the environmentalist is
expectancy,
out in the
everything
field
in
with
that
them. Yeah.
windmill is at best a net zero, at best. And what's interesting to me, coming from agriculture, like you've said, and I lived in California, so I moved to California in 01, and you're going to remember these days, is I remember back then moving there in 01, and there was one of my friends, they lived in Modesto, and they had a methane capture machine, and they had an engine where they were going to, burn this renewable gas in order to generate their own electricity.
Power.
And they were told, no, you can't. Because the state of California said, no, you can't, because we know this gas being released into the environment is harmful. But once you put it into an engine, we know what that engine is pumping out, and we know that gas, that exhaust does not meet our regulations. And it was at that moment, it's like, you can't see the forest through the trees. Meaning we'd much rather have a diesel generating engine that's, running
particulate
diesel that we get from
worse.
somewhere, but that particulate matter we're okay with, as opposed to we're going to allow you to capture something harmful out in the environment and reuse it. And, just what's funny is then to see 15, 17, 18 years later where they turn suit, because like, oh, now we have a reason to do this. And to me, what I gathered is that the big energy companies, like you talked about, we can take this advantage of it. In other words, we can use this as CO2 offsets, where now we want to be a part of this as opposed to being opposed to it. Is that fair?
No, that's part of the story for sure in the evolution. And I think, look, with respect to legislating change, I wish it were that legislation wasn't required. And there's some behavior you can't legislate, but some markets, in order to influence, you have to create parameters, you have to impose regulation. I get there's a balance there. And I think what we saw in the case of, the opportunity you talked about with respect to biogas to power in California, there was no real incentive to do so. So you had some mom and pop shops that were just doing this out of a best practice. And then there were some federal tax credits, like the old Section 29, Section 45, that then created a tax incentive to capture the methane. And then there was, do you remember these renewable portfolio standard programs, or RPS, goals and objectives? So California was a leader in that. I can remember when it was like 15%, 25%, basically a requirement for electricity producers to derive a percentage of their power from renewable resources. And so once the state realized, there's an opportunity to actually leverage existing technology to create a regulatory framework that creates market demand that then holds these high polluters accountable, right? That's where I think government has a role. They stepped in, I think, did a good job. We now are up to 37 different states that have RPS programs. California's continued to lead. I think sometimes as a state, we are infatuated with the leadership position that we hold, and we take things sometimes too far. And sometimes, the regulation gets out in front of the opportunity, and we have a solution in search of a problem a lot of times. But I do think that there's a role for government. There's a role for policy. And certainly that's a lot of what consumes our organization's bandwidth, right? At the federal, state, provincial levels is advocating for common sense, pro-RNG policies through legislative, regulatory, and legal arenas. But yeah, I mean, look, the to their credit, and I specifically call out, BP, Shell, Chevron, because they've demonstrated incredible leadership and sort of being the first in the oil sector to sort of acknowledge what we are doing and who we are as an industry. And they've created multiple joint ventures. They're members of our organization. They recognize the opportunity that we're talking about, and they've bought in, right? It's still not their core business, for sure. We're conscious of that. But, to have turned them, if you will, from ardent detractors and blatant opposition to now literally putting money and investing into these facilities. Because look, the reality is World Bank estimates that, again, with all of our programs and policies in place, we're expecting organic waste to increase 70%, 70, by 2050. Right. And we used to export our trash and our crap to China and India, and those countries are literally fed up with our refuse. They're not taking our guff anymore, right? So it's really forcing us as a society to reconcile what are we doing with the waste we produce? And that's where our industry steps in as a ready solution to help improve current waste management practices.
The mental image that just hit me was from Back to the Future when Dr. Brown is, putting the I would say the food refuse into the time machine and
Yeah.
using that as fuel. And ironically,
exactly.
That's what we're doing, because as I understand, whether it is table scraps that end up somewhere, whether it's our personal waste that end up somewhere, my job as a nutritionist for cows was taking our human waste and feeding it to cows to produce a product. So we're really, this whole idea of, like one of the commentary pieces that I had is like, we can't justify renewable biogas or, renewable natural gas. We can't justify it because that just perpetuates the problem of big ag. And it's just
that is the biggest argument that we butt up against currently. Which
is crazy. Well, it's difficult for me. It's difficult for me growing up in the industry, understanding the industry, and saying, hey, here's the challenge. We just got done going through a period of extreme inflation when it comes to food costs, right? A big component of that is energy, production, transportation. A large component of that escalation is energy. You went from, hey, what it costs to produce a pound of beef or a gallon of milk drove up dramatically because of energy costs that apply to everything. And we're giving an opportunity to those animal producers to say, hey, you can be better for the environment, and you can actually reduce and kind of diversify some of your income and or costs through this program, which ultimately could possibly make our food more sustainable and more cost effective. Yeah, that's a bad idea.
Yeah. No, you nailed it. And I'd love, Tyler, first, I want to make sure that I have your informal commitment at least to come on our podcast.
I'd love to.
Our industry podcast, we call it Coalition Conversations. I don't moderate that. That's our comms guy, senior manager of comms, Dylan Chase. He's fantastic. But I'd love to invite you to come on and share your perspective with your ag background to just counter with facts the notion that we're constantly coming up against, including claims like if we're effectively creating programs that incent methane capture from dairy farms, other livestock agriculture operations, that we're incenting farmers to then increase the size of their herd. Like, this is so disconnected from reality, right? Coming from advocates, white collar, who are representing interests that are varied and certainly politically motivated, but have no connection to what it's like to actually run an agricultural facility in California, no less, and have no concept of how thin the profit margins are, right, to run a herd. Like, the idea that you're going to increase the herd size to produce more methane, to get more credits, more credit share in the value from the credits that transact from, it's asinine, right?
Part of the challenge there is, here's where it leads today. Like, one of the things that's gone on in agriculture, specifically dairy, is, one thing that's leading the industry as a revenue source isn't necessarily milk, because most retailers sell milk at a bare profit at a minor loss. And so back through the chain, dairy farmers aren't making this exorbitant amount of money. But what they've actually done is use dairy cows to produce beef animals, because there's been a reduction in the beef herd. And so it's kind of like, no, what that does is that keeps them in operation so we can level out the ups and downs. So that way we don't have this mass reduction in people involved in the industry. Like the amount that I have watched the dairy industry, consolidate. And you're saying, well, why do dairies get bigger? Well, because the margins are so thin, you have to have more units so you can make at least some type of profit when you can. And we've seen over the last, 10 years, more than 50% of the industry go out of business.
Yeah.
And that's not long-term sustainable. And so when we talk about some of these,
they can't afford to operate, right?
Well, my joke with some of my friends is the reality of the dairy industry is you break even for 3 months of the year to cover up for the 9 months of the year that you're losing your butt. And there is no, I mean, your gain of profitability is either appreciation over time by the assets, the animals, whatever there, but it's not really making a lot of money. People in agriculture that make money is generally because of an offshoot or a land or something there. It's not to do with the actual enterprise of agriculture. It really is a love of it. That's why it's been so difficult to have people participate. But let me move along. And let me say, you brought up a great point where we had this kind of edict from Biden Harris. We're going to move all of this to electrical. And then we saw the real challenge in the electrical transmission, where we actually have now seen a backfill of some, natural, gas, those things. Where do you see with this new administration, as you're sitting here, we're a week away as we're recording this from the inauguration, as you're looking forward, as you're preparing the industry, what do you see happening, or what do you see as the opportunity as we go through in the energy sector?
That's a great question. And if only I had a crystal ball, right?
Just here,
but
just
yeah, yeah, me too, right?
Yeah.
Same hairdresser. No, but I think the advantage we have is, and this is what we communicated to our industry and our members in advance of November, was that we have a little bit of foresight in that we've been through 4 years of Biden Harris, and we've already been through, a Trump Pence administration. So we have a little bit of insight into what could be. I think there's a lot of different, and this is purely speculative, right? Because we still just don't know. I mean, we're constantly in communication with federal regulatory agencies, the White House, and trying to track down and keep in touch during the transition, setting up meetings, even post January 20. But we don't really know. But there's things we can look at and speculate on. For example, the relationship that Trump has with Elon, right? I mean, I don't think that's insignificant. And I think Elon's influence will extend beyond just government efficiency, right? I don't think for a moment, Elon's willing to just, bench Tesla. I think he still wants to maximize and grow that company. And I think it's a data collection company more than it is an OEM. But what did Tesla's run on? Electricity, right? When you look at, and not to suggest that there's any connection or coincidence, right? But however much it was, I don't know, $45 million a month for the last 90 days of the presidential campaign that Musk was pledging to Trump. He already had some measure of access. So usually that's what we pay for, right? With federal contributions through PAC active, right? It's access. He has that. More than most. So what is he paying for? I don't know. Remains to be seen. I would speculate to say that probably a Trump administration is the first priority is not going to be taking action through EPA to eliminate the prospect for renewable electricity to generate certain energy credits under the renewable fuel standard. My goal is that, or I don't suspect that that's the goal of the Trump administration. I think when you look at Trump coming in, he's really got 2 years, right, before he's a lame duck, without potential for being elected again. So I think, what are his priorities for the first 2 years? I think government efficiency is one of those, right? Reducing our deficit, our spending, and making government more efficient. I don't think, eliminating the opportunity for farmers across the Corn Belt and the entire United States, municipalities, right, where organic waste is also aggregated at landfills and wastewater treatment plants. I don't think that's high on his radar to say we got to stop producing energy from there because we need to keep buying oil from the Middle East. You can do both, right?
I think that's an interesting segment because, if you look back and you understand this, I understand the advent of, ethanol, right? And how that became such a massive industry, biodiesel, right? And yet those have matured to a point where we're not seeing growth there. It's growth, as you mentioned. Are we consolidating this waste and using that to generate methane, biogas? But here's the thing that I just wonder. One of the challenges we've seen, and I think this is an opportunity to balance our absolute fossil fuels with renewable energy. And I think one of the challenges is like, hey, we have these electric vehicles. Great, great. How do we generate energy to recharge them? We have all these electric, tools and implements and batteries. How do we generate the energy? Because it's been either wind, solar, nuclear, whatever else. Do you see there's an opportunity for, really biogas being an energy generator for Teslas? Is that even a possibility?
Oh, it is, and it's a possibility under existing federal regulation. So I mentioned the Renewable Fuel Standard, or the RFS program, which was implemented under George W. Bush, right? So it was signed into law by a Republican president and has existed through administrations on both sides of the aisle and has ebbed and flowed, but has certainly been one of the principal policies that has driven our industry's growth, right? The RFS was created for the corn ethanol industry, but that industry never matured. And so a few years back, gosh, it's been almost 10 years ago now, July of 2014, we had a unique opportunity, a win-win for the government and for our industry. We were able to demonstrate that most of the feedstock used to produce renewable natural gas is cellulosic or hemicellulosic, right? And so we were able to educate, advocate, and ultimately gain access into the program and help EPA save face by maintaining a program that our industry was able to step in and help fill. And we've done that for the better part of 10 years. And within that regulation, absolutely, there are pathways that theoretically EPA could approve that would allow raw biogas to be combusted to generate electricity that's then used to charge Teslas or Rivian or Prius or whatever, right? I think the challenge before EPA, and look, our industry is split on this, right? There's probably half of our stakeholders that are supportive of biogas to electricity under the renewable fuel standard. The other half kind of view it as a market threat. So our job as sort of industry arbiter would step in and advocate to make sure that if government moves forward, that they do so thoughtfully and that they implement a program that strikes the right balance, right? So that we're talking about creating additional market demand for biogas to electricity, not taking the market demand set for RNG to vehicle fuel and then reducing that by the proportion volume used for electricity. So, and that's complicated. That's weedy, and most of your audience probably doesn't care about that.
Yeah, but here's the crux of all that is, if we look at one of the major factors that affected this, just recent election was energy costs and its role in our cost of living. So as we roll some of these forward, as we look at these opportunities, does that diversification, does that bringing in of renewable forces, how much does that offset our this mandates that drove up some of our costs? Does that make sense? Did I phrase that right?
Well, I think energy is expensive, right? And I think the luxury of oil is that we're able to tap and access it pretty cost effectively. And the same thing was true of natural gas, conventional natural gas. We have an inordinate supply beneath our feet here, even in the United States, right? Now we're a net exporter of LNG, for example. So, cost is always a factor. I think renewables are always expensive, at least initially. You saw the same thing with the solar industry, right? The cost of a solar panel is now a fraction of what it was when the technology was nascent. And again, that was supported by federal, state legislation and ensuing regulatory programs. And our industry is not subsidized, right? So we were able to gain access into existing programs. Speaking of subsidies, the oil industry is still subsidized by the federal government. And so all we're looking for is a level playing field where we can take a common sense approach and just capture the inevitable environmental impact of greenhouse gas emissions like methane and CO2 from our growing waste streams. So there's one service to society. And then once we've captured that, let's convert that captured CH4 and CO2 into fuel, heat, power, and other products that, again, help to decarbonize our economy in a real thoughtful, meaningful, and affordable way. And the benefits are also growing energy independence and security. You look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict from these recent years, and that's a cautionary tale. We look at how much of Europe had to pivot from natural gas to biomethane or RNG or biogas because of their limited access to supply from Ukraine and Russia, right? So, considering the resource that we're sitting on, it's just a common sense path forward. And I think increasingly elected officials on both sides, they all are recognizing that. Our goal is to try to keep this from becoming a political play and keeping everyone focused on the practicality of the value proposition that waste to RNG represents. And look, we're not under any illusion that RNG, even from our existing waste streams, is going to completely eliminate the need for oil or natural gas or even other renewables. Quite frankly, we're interested in a circular economy that is really after sustainability, right? What can we sustain, not just from an organic standpoint, but what can we sustain over a long period of time, right? And one thing we know, we learned this through COVID, is we need energy in order to maintain our current lifestyle, right? We could follow a non sequitur a little bit and prognosticate about what is really going to be the primary source of energy demand in the future. I think it's AI, right? You probably already do this, Tyler, but an AI search through ChatGPT requires 10 times the amount of energy than just a Google search. But people don't think about that because they're just talking into their phone or they're typing a search in their web browser, right?
Let me restate. If I choose to use ChatGPT, to generate, to make my job easier, it takes 10 times the energy. So to me, that's an energy transfer. Instead of me putting in the energy, someone else, something else, a tool is doing it. That's a big number.
So, and that's a market that's still evolving, right? And what I'm concerned from an energy standpoint is we are creating a growing interdependence on technology like AI without any forethought about what energy is going to actually support the functionality, right? And who's going to pay for that? And what's the impact on our electricity? Are there going to be increasing blackouts and brownouts because everyone's downloading Perplexity or whatever ChatGPT app of choice, right? And so back to my comment, we're not under any illusion that our industry value proposition is a single solution, but it's got to be part of a common sense solution that the Trump administration continues to support. And it's not an insignificant amount of energy either. Right now, when we look at our total production potential just in the United States, it's enough to replace about 13 to 15% of total gas demand in America, which is which is about 45% of industrial demand, about 75% of residential, or 100% of commercial gas demand nationwide. So it's not insignificant, right? But look, there's plenty of balance there for wind and hydrogen and
still need all the rest
solar.
of the people at the table.
And Europe's 30 years ahead of us.
Okay, so that last point. Oh, you said something pretty amazing there. Let me share a story. So in my previous career, right, doing nutrition for dairy cows, I also worked for a company and consulted commodities, and I had a client that lived in Ohio. And he was originally from the Netherlands. And his brother, he immigrated to the U.S. His brother immigrated to Germany at the same time. They both built dairy farms, one in Germany, one in the U.S. And at that point, this was early 2010s. His brother had a full methane capture. They were capturing methane, and he was making as much money at that point, capturing the methane, energizing it, doing all those things, as much money on that as he was his dairy. And yet his brother in the U.S. was not allowed to put in any infrastructure, he already knew what was the capability. He wanted to just run his own equipment, power himself, and he wasn't allowed to because of some of the regulations. And so one of the things that you bring up is, you talked about California being the leader. How much is the rest of the world, and especially the EU, a leader in some of these things where, kind of our ignorance and our arrogance in the US think, oh, we got it all figured out. It's like, no. Other places have done way more, and it's just commonplace what we're talking about. Is that
Correct. I
true?
mean, right, because what we're after is essentially a circular economy, right? And much of, many countries in Europe are doing that already. You mentioned Germany, Netherlands, Denmark, even Italy to some extent. But yeah, they figure out how to integrate wind and solar with hydro, with nuclear, and with RNG. It just makes sense, right? We I'll use the collective we here, Tyler, right? But love to preach diversity and inclusivity, and we want a diverse stock portfolio, and we want
Yeah.
diversity at XYZ, except for when it comes to energy,
But
right?
yeah,
We want to put all our eggs in one basket. We want to electrify everything. And yet it's so
because it's
obviously
free.
short-sighted
It's
and
free.
ignorant.
Johannes, it's free when it's electric.
Yeah, exactly. It's a
I
fantasy.
just
I'm
plug
jumping
it
in my
into the
remote.
wall.
Exactly. And it's classic NIMBYism, right? And the reality is you're right. It's also a form of arrogance, I think. It's, I want to feel good, like I'm doing my part by driving my Tesla out of my garage. There's no tailpipe emissions from my vehicle, with no regard for where the power plant is actually located and the amount of emissions that are impacting, disadvantaged communities. Right. So, then you could digress, talk about the battery. Where does the car battery come from? What rare earth minerals like lithium and cobalt are mined in which countries that are, child labor implications, right? The carbon footprint of shipping the batteries or the minerals to America. And then what do you do with the batteries when they don't work anymore? Where do you bury them? What's the impact? We don't like landfill, but we have to bury our batteries, right? What are we doing? So it's just, and what's encouraging to me, Tyler, so in our membership, we also, a few years ago, changed our membership structure to now colleges, universities can join our organization free of charge. And it's just an attempt to open up an education pathway where we're learning and sharing and cross-pollinating. And so we've had the opportunity to meet with and speak to and lecture in front of hundreds and thousands of college students. And it's super encouraging. They're not blindsided or hoodwinked by all the politics and the propaganda. They see right through all that. And the prospect of being able to convert waste into productive energy and products, they're like, how do we do more?
Yeah,
Right.
just makes
And
sense.
yeah, and composting is fine. I get that, like on a household level, that makes sense. But in aggregate and in larger quantities, you're forfeiting the energy content from that decomposition process. So why not benefit from both? Soil amendments and energy. So yeah.
Love it. Let me take this. We obviously know each other through a leadership capacity, leadership space. What's the biggest leadership challenge either in the industry or as you yourself are going out and having these conversations? And, what's the biggest leadership challenge you face? And like, this is something we have to address.
That's good. Well, I think it's always incumbent on the leader to be able to envision a path, and be able to then articulate the path forward to constituents that don't have that vision. And I think inherently there's both a challenge and an opportunity there, right? And so, that's sort of been our objective from day one when we identified and confirmed back in 2011 that there was no trade association, there wasn't an advocacy voice or policy platform representing what was then referred to even in America as the biogas industry. It was unconscionable to me. And at the time, I was legislative director working in state capitol in Sacramento. So I knew that if you weren't at the table on key negotiations, right, you're on the menu. And so I couldn't believe that an industry existed without any representation. So God Open Doors gave us the opportunity to form what has become the coalition, the RNG Coalition. And we started with 6 companies and now represent over 400 leading companies operating across the entire industry value and supply chain. That's incredibly humbling. But at every step, at every turn, whether it was getting legislation passed and then implementing the regulation, or protecting an existing market, or expanding, creating new and diverse market demand for the industry's products, it's, again, being able to see further than where we're at, where the industry truly needs to go, and then articulating the footsteps, the practical 1, 2, how do we get there from where we are, back to people who are putting trust in your organization, not to lead them astray, right? And so there's micro challenges there, there's macro challenges there. We've been incredibly blessed. We've been able to assemble an incredible team of staff in-house here at the coalition, and then our membership. from elected leaders who are chairing our labs to members that populate each of those committees and enable us to advocate on their behalf with their annual member dues. It's incredibly rewarding and humbling and challenging at the same time, but I love it, right? If I had to pick one particular, it's the Political Action Committee. The state level, we do pretty well because companies can write checks to PACs. But at the federal level, you can't write company checks, right? You can only write personal checks. And so it's really a test of leadership for our member companies, right? Like, you want your company to do well, and you're an incredible leader, across the board, our companies, but are they willing to put their money where their mouth is? Are they willing to write the personal check in order to gain the access, in order to leverage the influence, in order to ultimately affect policy and market outcomes? I mean, that's just how the game is set up, particularly at the federal level, right? So that's a challenge, right?
Is that access really knowing more and before, or is it helping to influence, as we talked about, some of these regulations that really just, they need to be altered to better apply?
Well, I think it's both, right? And I think you have a dynamic where I don't know what the member of Congress, how many people they're representing now, but it's millions of people. And so among that demographic, you have countless constituents and business interests that are vying for very limited amounts of time. And, Congress members are in office for 2-4 years a shot. So they're hardly identifying where the bathroom is before they're having to focus on fundraising to, refill their campaign coffers to stay in office. So I get that. I've been there. I've worked and fundraised and supported people in that position. So I get it. And at the end of the day, if I'm not willing, Tyler, to support your campaign to keep you in office, then why should you spend time in office helping me? So look, it's for better or worse, it's the system we have. And so it's you pay to play to gain access. And I think the access is important because, look, I've had the opportunity to take senators and Congress members to RNG facilities, most recently a dairy farm, Central Valley, California. And there's just nothing like, seeing is believing, right? And you can say a lagoon cover or an anaerobic digester, but until you see it. So I got on top of the lagoon cover, and sort of this helium effect of like you springing
it's a
up
trampoline.
and down, up and down.
Yeah,
100%. And the senator could identify what the springboard was actually methane that was captured, and so it was a poignant, kind of like visualization of, oh, I see the benefit to the environment. You're literally capturing and avoiding methane emissions, right? And if that cover wasn't there, all that would be going. So you don't have that unless you have access. You don't have access unless you're providing support. So I get that, but it's still hard to kind of get, folks to buy in on that level and write personal checks, right? It's easier for companies to do that. So that's a particular challenge. We're working through that. We're getting there. The benefit there is that, look, we also know that if we had fully funded federal PACs, we wouldn't be able to compete with the other PACs out there. So, we take what we got. We've always been able to punch well above our weight.
I want to go back a little bit to some of that funding that maybe people don't understand is, part of, like you said, it's organizations within the state level can write checks. On the federal level, it's more of a personal, like, what do you think? Is it their own personal agenda that keeps them from engaging that? Like you mentioned, the senator being able to see it, does he need more of his constituents to be able to see that to then help fund that? Is that really the challenge of the storytelling?
Well, okay, so PACs are funded by stakeholders, right? In terms of getting an elected official, a senator, congress member, legislator, to support policy, it is political for them too, right? So before they can, wrapping their head around something is certainly step one. There's an education gap. Once they understand, they absolutely have to factor in and calculate the political implications of any choice or vote that they're making. And so we actually learned this during COVID, right? As an advocacy organization, most of our time was spent advocating directly to elected officials, federal, state, provincial, legislators, regulators. During COVID, when they literally had a cyclone fence around the Capitol and everything was forced to go virtual, we realized an opportunity and a need to educate the general public as much as we were elected officials. And doing so is a prerequisite to create the political cover that lawmakers need in order to support policy that we're asking them to support. So, we raised over $1 million in 2020 to build out the education sort of arm of our organization. And we're still working to, amplify that voice and storytelling. But I love that point. You storytelling. I mean, everything is storytelling, right? So we're trying to get better at that too. Yeah. And appreciate you having me on to kind of share our story here to a new and diverse audience. I didn't realize how much we had in common. I think there's business opportunities for us, Tyler. So I'll ping you offline too. And love to explore that and leverage. Well, I'd love to leverage your expertise too. And I don't know if you're still taking clients or need clients, but you probably know, in addition to George, more than I realize. So
yes, so we'll talk more about that. But one final question, Johannes, where can people learn more about you, the coalition, all of that stuff?
Coalition website, rngcoalition.com. And we have just a treasure trove of information available for free, downloadable, accessible for the public. Our staff director's there, so my contacts there as well. LinkedIn, probably the social that I'm most active on. I've never ventured into TikTok. I've got an Instagram. I don't post very often, kind of private that way. But just honored that you'd have us on, Tyler.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you to all of our viewers and listeners. Remember to subscribe on YouTube. Hit the subscribe button. Make sure you hit the bell so that way you get notified whenever we release new content. Then one more thing. If you could rate and review this episode wherever you listen to it, that way more people can find out about impactful leaders like Johannes. Until next time, choose to lead with impact.